French.
This is Ted Diamond.
And this is the Awareness Connection, a podcast where we talk about mind-body awareness, health, human development. This is our 14th episode. And today we're going to be talking about a related topic, but something that we haven't spoken about before, which is the topic of developmental movement. Ted, you and I have been talking about this for a few weeks now, at least, and you're in the middle of writing a book about this. And we've been speaking so much about it that so many different topics have come up underneath the umbrella of developmental movement that we just felt compelled to do a couple of podcast episodes on this.
Yeah, and we're doing a course on this in March of 26.
Yeah.
Which is why we're thinking about, this is something I've been working on for years, but in preparation for the course, I'd like to have at least some of the material for the book completed, so we have a full curriculum.
Yeah.
So what is developmental movement? We need to explain, yeah?
Yeah. What is it? Then we'll get into why should we care? How is it related to what we've previously spoken about? How is it related to things like, the primary control issue, the postural system, movement in general? What's its history? There's a lot of stuff to talk about here.
Yeah.
Really rich.
Topic. Well, first of all, developmental movement is the study of infantile stages of progress toward being, upright and fully mature at the motor level. You could include other functions, like visual and fine motor. But, when I'm speaking about it here, we're speaking largely about those motor stages from an infant lying helpless in the crib to being able to track objects, raise her head. I say her, it's him or her. Raise her head, roll over, push up on her arms, begin to maybe crawl on all fours, etc. But applied to adult development, there's sort of another subject, which is what the book is about, where as adults, we can look back on these progressive stages of development as part of understanding how we function and how to gain greater awareness of how we function, because we contain within us these sort of developmental stages, and yet they've been very, very, cursorily studied. And there's really, there's a whole rich subject there that hasn't been fully, or in my view, hasn't been fully articulated.
All right. Yeah. This, what you've just said makes me think about that, the one topic of is it ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny?
Yeah, I had the same thought, James.
Yeah. Great minds think alike. So, that very interesting notion, and we've spoken about this over the past couple of weeks together. That very interesting notion from, what is it? Was it Haeckel's?
Yeah,
that's the person's name.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
a biologist. What, a 19th century biologist?
Yeah.
Pointing out that ontogeny, meaning the development of an individual organism from conception to, is it conception to birth or is it conception to death?
More. Oh, good question. Maybe to maturity, I would say.
Okay, all right. From
in between.
Like from the very beginning of conception, where it's a couple of cells meeting together, to full maturity, recapitulates or follows the exact same maturational progression as the evolution of its species did in the history of life on Earth. This is a very interesting idea, and it was very suggestive at the time, and it was maybe a new idea. It was based a lot on what was fomenting in the world of biology at the time, which was Darwinian evolution and all the ideas that were coming up on it, or through it and from it.
Yeah.
Not completely accurate. Clearly, there was a lot to say about this and a lot of criticism of this idea, but it's still a very interesting notion.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was so when Haeckel's first presented the idea, it was one of those ideas that caught on, and he became well known for the idea. But then when people actually looked at the detail, he said, "Hey, look at the embryo, human embryo," and he had pictures showing a human embryo in different stages of development. And then he compared it to, a pig or a monkey, and showed how similar the human embryo is to these other animals, which reflect kind of different levels of progression and evolution, since a monkey as a primate is progressed sort of further, let's say, than a pig. People thought, wow, that's incredible. But when they looked closely at it, they realized that there was not exact comparison. So then he was attacked for being inaccurate, and the idea was sort of scrapped. But as is often the case when people scrap an idea, not to push the pun, they throw out the baby with the bathwater, because the truth of it is that although there is no point in the embryo's development that exactly replicates the other animals at that sort of equivalent stage, like reptilian or mammalian or something, the fact is that we do traverse this incredible expanse of evolution, and we do in fact go through a fish-like stage, an amphibian, reptilian, mammalian, then primate mammalian, and then human primate mammalian stages. So there's a lot of richness in the idea, and developmental movement, and people who study it and people who have developed ideas about it, often reflects that. And I find that interesting because we still haven't. There's still aspects of infant development that need to be understood, and can only be understood when you look at some of these earlier stages or earlier parts of our evolutionary past and how they contribute to this complex human version of a vertebrate.
Yeah. Well, where do you want to go from here, Ted? So, I'm thinking about, talking about how a human infant goes through stages, especially in their movement and their coordination. We can go there. We can talk about the history of developmental movement as an idea. The history of it as a practice. What do you think?
Well, I think it's useful just to look at some of the key kind of stages of progression in an infant's development. It's lying helpless. That's sort of the first stage.
Yeah.
If you sort of amphibian is kind of transitional, but let's say the next stage would be something like reptilian stage, where you see an infant crawl, doing the commando crawl or doing versions of crawling, and where you see pattern of limb advancement on one side. They look more reptilian, and you see infants in the crib, lying like that. Crawling on all fours, which is more like a quadruped, more like a dog or a cat. And then clambering to the upright. So you have those key stages in an infant's development. Again, you have, because when you outline these different stages, because kids have tremendous variability, the notion that we go through these defined stages has also been attacked, a little bit like Haeckel's theory.
Yeah.
But the truth is that we have to go through some kind of stages. So a lot of kids do not crawl on all fours, on hands and knees. A lot of kids will never do that particular form of locomotion. They might just roll and some infants can roll across the room to get to an object.
Yeah.
some will scoot and on their butt and never go on all fours. And
Hmm.
from there, they can clamber. But the fact is that all those stages are sort of in us, and it's useful as adults to explore those stages, whether we went through them or not.
Mm.
So that's part, it's just good to sort of
Yeah.
outline a
Yeah.
few stages. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're really distinguishing here between development in the womb, which kind of like more precisely follows the progression where ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Well, not completely, of course, but like, we go through a gill stage and like a gill fish like tadpole stage, and then all this. But then when we're born, we have two arms, two legs, no gills, unfortunately. We've got a head. Um, but unlike some other mammals, especially, but like a lot of other vertebrates, we don't come out ready to walk. We don't come out ready to do the movement necessary in order to gain our survival or to perpetuate our lives. Like, I've seen embryonic photos, like in fetal photos of dolphins swimming around
Mm,
in their mother's womb, or like an elephant baby, like an elephant fetus, like moving their limbs, or
yeah.
a horse is similar, an antelope. And you see in a lot of these other animals, like within the first day or two, especially if they're a prey animal, like an antelope, they've got to get themselves up on their feet and start walking very, very quickly, or else they're going to be eaten. Humans are born, as has often been pointed out, with almost as a fetus that needs to develop outside of the womb
Yeah.
for maybe
Most
a
of the,
period of
yeah,
a couple of years.
right. Yeah. Like a lot of, yeah, like other primates, very helpless, needing a lot
Mhm.
of, um, a lo- and like a lot of mammals, needing a lot of attention, a lot of care from the mother. Yeah. And then having to learn all those stages of movement. So here you have a very developed, um, when the infant is born, very highly organized and developed in one way, but having to and capable of grasping, very quickly beginning to see and to coordinate what they see with hand movements, and
Mhm.
yet completely helpless in terms, so very advanced in a lot of ways, but very helpless and having to learn everything almost like from scratch,
Yeah,
and needing
yeah,
that stimulation of being on the ground, and wanting to raise their head and wanting to look around and needing stimulation and needing, um, that sort of interaction with the environment and with a caregiver. So it's, yeah, interesting, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so a child, like an infant in the first year or two, no, no two children go through the exact same progression, but there is a large progression that's required from when an infant is born to the time that they're able to walk around independently.
Yeah,
And, even if one particular infant doesn't go through a crawling stage, um, they've got to go through some long process in order to get themselves on their 2 feet and start coordinating that.
yeah, exactly, and so fascinating to watch and to see. So this is something you know, as you know, I've been interested in for years. So let me just say a bit about the sort of subject of developmental movement as it
Yeah.
applies to adults. So coming to this field, when I was 21 and I was getting interested in this whole subject, I learned pretty early on that that some people were studying movement from the point of view of how we adults have learned to go through these phases. And there were various researchers who linked, again, based on the evolutionary ideas that you mentioned, James, linked the stages of development in a child, in an infant, with neurological growth.
Mm.
And of course, there is a link. When you see, I don't know, a reptile is capable of sort of very stereotyped limb movements. Those limb movements get much more complicated, let's say in a horse. They link that with neurological complexity, because in order for a horse to move, and a horse is far more complex, far more emotionally subtle in its relationships with animals and people, it's capable of much more spontaneous actions. In order for the horse to become horse, there's all parts of the brain that are more evolved, more complex. So people linking those things said, well, is it possible that in the same way that neurological development parallels motor complexity, that if an adult or a child presents with some deficit, is it possible that they haven't gone through a certain phase of movement, and that's why their neural development has been impaired? So they advanced the theory that if a child, let's say, is having reading difficulties or other, more serious kinds of impairments, could you then go back in time with the child and see if they could relearn certain actions? These people, some of them claimed that if a child had reading difficulties, they must not have learned to crawl.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by that idea. I don't think it's true, and I think it goes it can become really irresponsible to say to a parent, let's say, well, if we can get your kid crawling, we'll get them reading. It's not as simple as that.
Right.
They made that link, and then people developed whole series of movements for adults based on going through these phases.
Mm.
And that was some of my first introduction to the idea of developmental movement, was looking at these movement theories.
Yeah.
That linked progressive stages in movement with neural development.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'd almost like to stay there for a little bit and just talk about that, because it's a really subtle theory, and it's like it's subtle, it's interesting. It takes child development out of the realm of just complete psychologizing, like Freudian issues, like how Freudians for decades linked, say, autism to the coldness of the mother or something like this. These sort of early childhood human connection issues, and this is sort of taking it, like taking child development, like you said, it's on like a neurological motor circle almost, like the brain, the personality, it's not separate from movement, like the neurological apparatus is not separate from our personality. So I think this is a really subtle theory, and it's like understandable to me, at least. Like it like seems kind of like I'm like sympathetic to the view that there might be a relationship between personality development or mental capabilities and the processing required to coordinate certain movements. And the fact that this has to like grow over time in a child. It's understandable that people would think this and like try it out.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, it's interesting because it's to my mind, there's a parallel with the Freudian view, because the parallel is that you say, well, if a child is autistic, was that related to the mother's coldness? Well, that's a pretty harsh, that's blaming the mother.
Yeah.
So there's that interpersonal component that's sort of more Freudian. But the parallel is that you're saying that the child has missed, that the impairment, the problem the child has, is related to missing something in its development. And that's the parallel with developmental movement theories, because you're saying that if a child can't read, it's because they've missed something in their development. And And I think that's a bit of a romantic conception because it's sort of implying that if only we could just go, if only we had gone through those stages properly and fully, we'd be fully realized. And then it
Mm,
even has a component that, as you say, relates to personality, because when people then teach the developmental movements, this is often true of body, mind, and somatic disciplines, in looking for the in looking for the meaning behind this learning process, they often located in emotional development. So you
mm,
see this in body work. They say, well, what's the point of doing body work? When we do body work, we can help fascia, we can help release tissues that are bound up, et cetera. What's the value of it? What's the purpose in doing that? Well, the purpose is that if you're tight, then there's some corresponding emotional state that we're releasing. So we're going to help you to be more open or more
yeah.
mature. Often maturity is the idea here that's sort of focused on. And people have done that with developmental movement. They say, well, um, your ability to perform certain movements is a sign of greater maturity. And I think that's a complete fabrication. I don't think that maturity has anything to do with it.
Mm,
And finding the real purpose behind it, to my mind, is a big part of making sense of this subject.
yeah.
And then
Okay.
when you say, well, what's the purpose? I mean, one thing about coming upright is that we're learning to use muscle groups properly. Well, that's not sexy. People say, well, so what? I mean, you're showing me how to use my muscles better. I thought you could show me something about being more conscious or being more self-realized. Well, sorry, it's not, it's not about it's not about being what you want it to be. It's about what it
Yeah.
is. And
Yeah.
one of the things the developmental movement is all about is how we actually come to the upright posture and
Mm,
what it means to be upright at a more conscious level. To me, that's an incredible thing, but
yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
people don't find it that interesting, really.
Well, yeah, it's amazing because, when you say it like that, um, first of all, it's very clear. But second of all, you're right. It's like not quite as sexy. It's not quite as like, well, yeah, like, why should I be interested in upright posture? Is this some sort of military thing? Is this some like aesthetic thing that you're teaching us? But then, when you dig in to this topic and this subject about like, upright posture, the postural mechanism, you realize that there's like, well, we just spent 13 episodes talking about it. We've just spent a long time talking about like the depths of this subject, and we've really just sort of touched on it up until now.
Right. Yeah. And the topic is that you become more conscious of your system, your neuromusculoskeletal system, and how it works as a matter of living more consciously. That to me is just a completely remarkable area of study that goes toward the highest emergent capacities of a human being. So to
Mm,
my mind, it's really a fascinating,
yeah, yeah,
subject.
absolutely.
Anyway, but I just want to mention that in looking at developmental movement, I found the ideas of going through those earlier stages interesting. But what I had to figure out, um, and I learned this partly from studying Alexander and from Raymond Dart, who are people that had studied this subject from a slightly different angle. I realized that there was a whole subject area there that hadn't been explored properly, there's never been a full curriculum developed and a full theory about it. And
Mm,
that's partly what the book I'm writing is about.
yeah,
And we can say a little more about that too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. I would love to hear about that, because it's not self-evident when you're, well, okay, well, so there's this whole practice then, like in in the training course that I did with you, you had us say getting on the floor in various positions, whether it's a supine position, but more specifically about the topic we're talking about today. like these sort of prone positions where your maybe arms are out at an angle and you're lying on the floor and your legs are out, or and you're experimenting with these like maybe perhaps static positions that mimic uh, what body position you would have to be in order to locomote along the floor like this, like a reptile would. You'd be
Mm.
like moving like this, or you have us in, say, like a crawling position on our hands and knees, and saying, okay, well, how do you arrange yourself there? How would you get yourself forward? How would you get yourself backward? So there's this whole practice, and so we've been talking theoretically now and sort of about the history of things, which of course there's a lot more to say about that. We can get into Raymond Dart, we can get into some other folks as well, but there's this whole practice that's attached to this, and it's not self-evident, and it wasn't self-evident to me as a student why you would be having us go through these things.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good starting point. So if you have, if you're doing, let's say, a very primitive infantile, if you're in a primitive infantile posture or trying out some movement sequence, a very, primitive one, like lying prone and rolling, let's say, to my mind, the first thing that even as a student, the first thing I saw was not simply that I was regressing in a good way, doing something that was regressive, but was helping me to gain sensory awareness, because it certainly will do that. When you're lying prone, either with your forehead in contact with the floor or the side of your head, you're giving yourself tactile input. That's primitive. We don't realize that we do this all the time. If you're upset and you lie down, you're putting yourself into an infantile posture, and it's no coincidence that we need to do that. Or if you're feeling weak, or if you're very upset and you need to, just recover from that.
Yeah.
Those are all beneficial, and it's a form of regression that's healthy, and we do it every night when we go to sleep. When we swim, we're putting ourselves in water, and part of the pleasure of swimming is feeling the water go along our skin, and we're stimulating ourselves in a way that is reminiscent of being in the womb, and is reminiscent of our deep evolutionary past. But in addition to that, the thing that I noticed early on when I did these sorts of postures was that I was giving myself a fully supported position. I was giving myself the contact and the support that allowed larger muscle groups that are often overworked, let's say in your shoulders or your back or your pelvis, a chance to let go. And I could feel not only that those muscles let go, but that deeper muscle tissues could then kind of work in a more natural way. Deeper postural support could come through. So now you're looking at returning to an earlier phase of movement, not because of the direct benefits it gives you, because there are direct benefits like quieting you down, let's say, or giving you sensory stimulation. But you're looking at the process of now being able to consider how to move and how to use muscles in a more efficient way. And that's an amazing process, because all of a sudden I thought, here I've had back trouble for a couple of years. All the exercises, all the awareness, all the claims of mind-body unity, none of it helped me. Everything pretty much made me worse. But now I could use this position in a really effective, constructive way to begin to elicit some kind of underlying natural postural support that allowed my body to work better. That's a big benefit of developmental movement.
All right.
In the process, you're not only getting things to function better, but for the first time, perhaps in your adult life, you're doing it at a more conscious level.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
you were doing that at 4 years old.
Yeah. Right.
But you were doing it instinctively. Now you're going back and you're able to do it more consciously.
All right. All right. So there's the issue you first brought up, which is that, like, getting on the ground with all of this contact with the ground on your head and your face and your arms, there's a lot of purely just tactile sensation coming through.
Yeah.
This is, this could be soothing, comforting. It's, you curl up with a blanket, or, you get a hug from, a loved one. There's all this tactile sensation, and it's soothing. So there's that sort of direct, I mean, I guess you could call it a benefit, but that direct pleasure, that direct soothing quality. But then you're saying, like above and beyond this, there's I don't know, I guess you could call it like a how things work element, like a mechanical element, like a
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
you're placing yourself consciously, intelligently in particular positions on the floor, and it allows muscles, like you said, that you might not have even really realized were constantly working, and to the point of overwork, holding you up. And if you place yourself consciously and intelligently, as opposed to just sort of flopping on the couch or whatever, um, these muscles can not only take a rest and not work, but the body seems to be able to like organize itself a little bit, or maybe a lot, and you're regaining some amount of function consciously.
Yeah,
So
because you're in a supportive position that is associated with a simpler working of the musculoskeletal system. And what an amazing thing,
yeah,
I mean, and what I learned early on, and then in graduate school, I actually read about this subject a little bit. But what I realized was that doing this is, when you do it therapeutically, it's fine. You go to a chiropractor and they put you on your back, okay, or
hmm
you do some other, or you're treated by a doctor. Then we don't think twice about the fact that we're in a reclined position, let's say. But when you're doing these sorts of movements, not for a therapeutic purpose, but as in an exploratory way, there's a certain, uh, prohibition against this, certainly in some cultures. So, when you're sitting around with a bunch of 60, 70-year-old people, the idea of sitting on the floor, certainly in America, is not accepted.
yeah, yeah,
Other cultures, more so. Um, but the idea that you could do this in a constructive way means that you can now do something that's sort of not socially correct, not politically correct, but in a really constructive way. And I love the idea of lying on the floor and exploring movement that way.
mm,
And I didn't care about the social correctness of it. I thought this is something that we need to do, and we should all be able to do. Everyone should be able to be on the floor and be able to get up from the floor. Now, I was just reading something about in Japan, people are on the floor, they're sitting on the floor um, much more, commonly than we would, let's say, in America. So the
yeah,
idea of getting up from the floor is a much more normal thing in that culture. The
yeah,
average
yeah,
the average 40-year-old American, I mean, can get up off the floor is like a disaster in
yeah,
in real time, and it's not. And then now people say, well, you need to be able to perform a movement of getting up from the floor because it indicates health and it's an indicator of longevity. It certainly is. We should all be able to do that. And you could explore that as a positive discipline.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I think that's really important part of
yeah.
it, practical part of it.
I remember hearing this is something I've told you. It's just kind of a funny anecdote. I remember hearing that Bertrand Russell, like he was a 19th and 20th century English philosopher, but he was Lord Russell. He was actually like an aristocrat, like a landowning landlord aristocrat from an old aristocratic family. And the way that his family was disciplined, like the lifestyle that they lived, was that after they woke up in the morning and dressed, they were forbidden, or they forbid themselves. It was like the austerity that they practiced. They would not sit or recline again until at least dinner time. So yeah,
Yeah, there's a
I don't think
very,
they were practicing developmental movement is
yeah.
what I'm trying to say here.
No, yeah, yeah, exactly.
you know but just like you're right, like the tragedy is that you take someone who is perhaps not fit or strong and doesn't spend any time on the floor, and doesn't have any practice getting up or anything, and you make them say 75 years old. If they wind up on the floor, it's a real problem. It's a real problem. If they
Yeah, yeah,
fall, aside from the likelihood of injury because of brittle bones, how are they going to get up?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we touched on these practical elements, James. I think there's more we should say about this. We're doing a practical course at through the Diamond Institute on Zoom, exploring this. But I think we should do another podcast about it. We could explore some of the other theories of movement, um, the philosophical idea of what it means to have evolved into this complex whole that includes parts and what
Mm-hmm.
that means. And we'll have more time to talk about it. How's
Yeah,
that?
yeah, we'll be talking about some of the scholars, particularly Raymond Dart needs to be spoken about. And Raymond Dart's influences are also a very interesting thing to talk about, which is not often talked about. Yeah, and some more of the practice. So yeah, like we'll be probably having a couple more episodes on this. So stay
Okay,
tuned.
good.
Yeah, but thank you for the conversation, Ted, and
Thank you.
we'll be continuing. And this is sensory motor. No, this is not sensory motor awareness. This is the awareness connection. We will be returning.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks
Thank you
everybody.
all.
All right.